This is Marketing Uncomplicated. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the show. I have Claudio Luis Vera with me today, who is a thought leader in accessibility, also an author and an analyst with over 20 years of experience in UX design and front-end development. He has led accessibility strategy at a major cruise company, at an accessibility startup, and has held leadership roles at 4 different digital firms. Today, small and mid-sized companies are being held accountable for the accessibility of their websites, and any third-party tool that uses such a scheduling system, reservation apps, or online stores. However, many of these industry solutions are geared to enterprises that can't afford to hire full-time accessibility teams. This podcast will help business owners understand the laws around disability and access and how better choices for accessibility on limited budgets, which is extremely important, and we're going to dive into that. Welcome to the show, Claudio.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on. This is a real pleasure to be able to talk about this. So, it's a real pet topic of mine to talk about accessibility. I worked, just kind of recap a little bit what you said. I worked in UX design and interactive for probably a good 20, 25 years. I mean, really since like the beginning of the web, and then did a shift about 8 years ago into doing accessibility full time. So I've kind of seen both sides of the table here in terms of,
Yeah.
designing for accessibility, like both from like the creative director and the developer side, and then also, from the accessibility side and, being a disability advocate. So both sides, have good points to make. And I think, when you get into stuff like, working with small businesses or medium-sized businesses, that's where a lot of the conflict really comes out because, you have tools, they've been built. A lot of my colleagues in accessibility, they work full-time for large enterprises. And then when it comes down to, hey, I've got like this storefront or I've got like a small business, the solutions and the stuff that they work on doesn't really apply to a smaller sort of, to a smaller enterprise.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a really important and good topic because I think a lot of in the beginning, I don't think it was as sort of recognized in terms of the need to have these features on a multitude of sites. Specifically, if you are a company that's in a service industry and somebody is showing up to your site to, book an appointment, or really anything. If they're purchasing a goods or products or services from you, I think it's highly important that you give them the ability to navigate, as Claudio is saying, from a UX. So that stands for user experience, from how folks navigate the site from end to end. And it's really coming down to not just enterprises that are being cracked down on from a legal standpoint, but also small businesses are as well. And really being caught in the line of fire of this can really be detrimental to any business. So I think being able to set yourselves up for success is crucial. So why don't we just take a step back, Claudio, and really discuss the evolution of online accessibility, and let's boil it down to talk about why people who have businesses and who have websites should really care about this.
Okay, well, from a time frame, the real law in the states that really applies is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that was signed by President George Bush Sr. In 1990. So you got to think this is like before the Gulf War and everything. So the law has been around for a while, and when it was written, the web wasn't around, so it wasn't really a thing. So they had language for access and accessibility in physical spaces and stores, and pretty comprehensive laws for that. And now it's 34 years later, and there still isn't language in that law that's specific to the web. So it's generally accepted by the courts that it does apply, but it is applied by different courts in the U.S. differently. And so you could say, okay,
not to interrupt you there. So each state will handle an accessibility issue that a company gets slapped a legal documentation, it gets handled differently based by state.
It's actually not by state. It's by federal districts.
Got
So
it.
there's like 11 or 14 different. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know about this, but there are different districts in the United States, and each one of those district courts may have a different interpretation. The ones that are most favorable to folks with disabilities are in Florida and New York and California, and that's coincidentally or not, that's where most of the cases are filed.
Hmm.
But it's kind of like, is it 100% certain whether um, the ADA applies to website, or is it like 90% certain? That's really kind of like the level of difference. But to say, oh, it doesn't apply to my website is kind of a reckless or sort of irresponsible sort of point of view, given the sort of risks that you take on. And stepping back, I mean, the real reason behind this law is that folks with disabilities have the same rights as folks who are able. So if your website works for able people, but it doesn't work for disabled people, I mean, essentially you're stomping on their civil rights, because you're saying, well, we're discriminating against you because we don't feel that my website, just like my brick and mortar store, doesn't work for you.
Yeah.
So it's kind of equivalent. I have a colleague of mine, Sherry Byrne-Haber, and she kind of says, well, would you be okay if your website didn't serve brown skinned people?
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
if you think that you can substitute, folks with disabilities, like our policy is, yeah, we only work for people with lighter skin, then it's kind of the same thing applied to disability. So if you can understand the civil rights along the same lines,
Lines. Yeah.
then it all starts making sense. So it kind of also goes to this to the social model of disability. So we can think of disability as something like somebody who has a disability is a charity case, or somebody who has a disability is a medical issue that needs to be corrected. And those are flawed models for looking at disability. Starting in the 1980s, there's a sort of other model for looking at it called the social model that started in England with disability activists. And it basically takes the point of view that if all of us were in wheelchairs, there would be no steps. If all of us had disabilities, then we would design everything that we do for those abilities. So it's not the physical impairment that's a disability, it's that society hasn't designed products to work for those physical impairments. So
Yeah.
you take that like a little tiny step further, and then you start thinking, well, those of us who build products that aren't accessible, we're the ones that are disabling people. It's
Yeah.
not the physical impairment that's disabling them.
Yeah.
So if you can kind of get your mind to think along that route, if you can get yourself to start thinking along those lines, then you start realizing, well, okay, we as business owners, or we as folks who develop software, I mean, we have a responsibility to those of us who are disabled to um, to really make sure that our products and our services work for them. And so this is where you start getting into the ADA, you start getting into web content accessibility guidelines, or WCAG, or people in my business call it WCAG. And these are basically guidelines that tell you how to build stuff accessibly.
Hmm. Now, what is the actual percentage of disabilities, or like people who are considered to have a disability in the US today? Is that
It's
upwards of like 25, 30%?
so the statistic that most people throw out is 20%.
Got it.
And but there's a statistic that I think is actually more relevant, which is the U.S. Census Bureau did a study, and they interviewed people and asked them, well, how many of you have difficulties performing the activities of daily living? So
Yeah.
these activities of daily living could be brushing your teeth, it could be
Yeah.
going downstairs, it could be any of those things. So if you and the response was, it was over 30% of
Wow.
people over the age of 18 who have difficulties performing those activities of daily living.
Yeah.
So if you use that as your benchmark for disability, that's like an enormous part of
It's
society. And
huge. It's huge.
it includes a lot of older folks because those
Hmm.
rates of disability increase as you get older.
Yeah, I mean, you're eliminating, if you as a business who is selling a product or a service, it will eliminate that percentage that could be potential customers for your business. It could be potential loyal customers for your business. So if you're thinking about, who your audience is, whether you've developed something for, disability, or whether you're not, but you still want everybody and anyone to be able to have access to your website, then 30% is a huge chunk of, missing what somebody can't perform a task or access or complete, what you actually want them to do from an end goal standpoint, which is either buy a product or book a service.
Right. And if you think of the 30% as a portion that you're not marketing to, or the market that you're not reaching, and let's say you're only reaching the 70% that's able, then adding 30% is really more like adding another half onto the 70% that you have already.
Yeah.
So it's huge. And you work, you work in SEO, you work in marketing. I mean, like if you're working with SEO and you could just squeak another 5%, of traffic, or you're trying to work in marketing and you're trying to get looking at conversion rates, to your storefront. I mean, these numbers are huge.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Totally, totally. So, in the sense of the process, what do you think is the biggest barrier to entry for a lot of businesses? Is it just unaware, or don't have the knowledge as to, like, how do I go about doing this? That, maybe it's going to cost me a lot of money. How can we begin to, just like with all things, and like one of the biggest reasons why I've started this podcast is, like, how do we break the noise? How do we mitigate what is happening in society today as it relates to the support of small business, to give them the entire toolbox in terms of setting themselves up for success, right? Because obviously we don't want somebody to start a business, build a website, they're cruising, they're making good, they're successful in their business, and then all of a sudden they get slapped with a huge lawsuit that is
Right.
something that could have been solved, right? You and I are working on a project that is similar. Somebody who's been around for 20 years got slapped with, you don't want to call it a silly lawsuit, but that there is a lot of sharks out there in terms of lawyers that have set up shop just to kind of target websites such as this. So that people are cruising to find out who has set up accessibility or not. So let's be
Right.
real here. There are situations where somebody is going to find you whether you like it or not. It's not like your website is falling on deaf ears, for example, right?
Right, right,
So,
right.
like, I'd love to hear what you're doing today to kind of break through that, to really make the small businesses aware of, or mid-sized companies, really, to kind of understand that this is something that you need to be focusing on.
So why don't we do this? Because there's a lot there to unpack. I
Yeah,
mean, there
yeah,
really is a lot. Let's break this down, into pieces. So the first thing is you have to realize, like, all the devices that we have now, computers, personal computers have been around since the 80s. So
yeah,
we've got 40 plus years of like assistive technology, of accessibility features that have been built into computers. You've got screen readers, things that like read the contents of a website to you. And they're like, how a blind person would be able to navigate your website and work with it. So the problem isn't that we don't have this tech, this adaptive or assistive technology to help folks with disability. The issue is that we're building stuff that doesn't play nicely with that tech.
yeah, yeah,
So it really is an issue of lack of awareness and lack of diligence there. Um, so the real kind of issue is that because there hasn't been a specific law in the states about accessibility, like digital accessibility, then it's kind of like nobody's out there policing you to say that there's an issue, in terms of like there's no federal part of the government that's going to that's going to detect that you have faulty website and fine you, say, $300 to $500.
yeah,
So that's kind of left it to turn it into this free for all where it's all being decided in the courts. and the stakes are much larger because you get an accessibility lawsuit and you're talking, tens of thousands or more. If you're a really large company, the fines could be in the millions in terms of
Yeah.
what you need to settle. So, but that burden is not on the people who create software or create website templates. The burden is on you, the business owner that hires that.
Yeah.
So the assumption is from the courts is that you're the one who's responsible for doing due diligence. You're the one who's responsible for understanding which website templates or what website software works well and is accessible. And the good news is that the templates have been getting better and better.
Yeah.
And the bad news is every time we introduce a new feature or something that's really fancy,
It
the
shakes it up.
developers who do that fancy feature
Yeah.
aren't necessarily diligent about it. So and you and I have run into this too, where it's
Sure.
like you want to have a form that's really cool, or you want to have something that pops up on the page, and those can be really problematic if the developers haven't been super diligent about it.
Yeah.
So my advice would be stay away from stuff that's flashy like that, um, and go for something that's a little bit more mature. So
Yeah.
if you're choosing software or you're choosing something to put on your website, look for something that's a little bit more tried and true,
Yeah.
because chances are they've worked out a lot of the accessibility bugs.
Yeah.
Um, but but yeah, I mean it's frustrating because it's kind of like you as a website owner, you need to know what is going to be accessible, what's not going to be accessible, and you have to do some of your due diligence. So, I mean, we've been working on a project together, which involves a WordPress website. So WordPress is kind of interesting because they do have themes that are accessible. So WordPress itself is, I would say, good, very good, not perfect in terms of accessibility, in terms of developing stuff. And there's a team of folks that are all volunteers that are working as like an accessibility team within the WordPress community, but they don't have the time to check out every single theme that's out there. So you have some themes there that are kind of they're flagged as accessibility ready. So if you go to WordPress.com and you choose, an accessibility ready theme, then it's going to be mostly accessible.
Hmm.
But you go in and you can start piling on all the plugins and stuff that you want. That's where you're going to run into problems with access.
Yeah.
So WordPress itself is pretty good. The themes can be good as far as accessibility goes, but not perfect. And then you can pile on all kinds of plugins. But I would say, stuff to stay away from. Stay away from carousels. Stay
Hmm.
away from stuff that pops up on its own. Stay away from things that have like forms and form elements that are non-standard.
And
Or
go
if you
into,
can,
yeah.
try to
Yeah.
try to test them before you really
Yeah.
go too heavily down the road.
And when you mean like non-standard, just like built in, like nothing fancy, or what do you mean by like forms that aren't standard?
So it really is like, all right, so this is a tough one because like my
Yeah.
background, on the web, I can recognize a button that's like a default HTML button from a
Yeah.
button that's been built in a framework like React.
Yeah.
Those, the ones that have been built in the frameworks generally can be problematic. Anything that is a default HTML is going to work guaranteed
Got it.
because it's been built to the standard and it's been built to these guidelines that have been around for decades. So that's going to work fine. But if you start getting into like React or you start getting into some of these other frameworks, your mileage may vary. So I'm not saying it's bad. It's just you're starting to kind of pile on a little bit of a risk. So if you really want to play it safe, that's how you would do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it goes into it goes into a lot of details in terms of, building out your website and ensuring that, you are paying attention. And like I like that you said that a lot of, whether you're building in Wix or whether you're building in WordPress or, what other platform you're building in, is to make sure at least start somewhere with having the ability to utilize the various templates so you're not like rebuilding everything from ground up.
Right.
So
You, and you don't want to be in the situation where you've you're using a base theme, and then you're customizing it on top of that, and then you're customizing on top of something that's not accessible in the first place, because then you've got a real mess that you have to clean up.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, think of it, as technical debt, or think of it as, like, what happens if you buy a used car?
Yeah.
You buy a used car, generally you want to have a friend who's a mechanic check it out to make sure that there's nothing wrong with it, because then otherwise you're buying an expensive fix along with the what you're paying for the vehicle.
Yeah.
So, and I would say, when you're building a website, think of, if it's not accessible when you build it, you're basically bringing in that same sort of technical debt with you.
Yes, totally. So walk us, I guess, through maybe walk us through not necessarily what you do for clients, because at the end of the day, if somebody gets slapped with a lawsuit, that's kind of like cleaning up, right? But it's walk us through a little bit about how you support from the standpoint of, let's get to a point where you are accessible so that you don't run into a legal issue. What are those steps? What do they look like? What do you kind of consult from that standpoint? And then we can talk about, well, if you are in a situation and there is a legal lawsuit that is presented, then how do we go about working through that?
So I would say, like, the first guideline is that accessibility doesn't happen by accident. So, a product or something that's digital, some sort of any third party thing that you're using, isn't going to be accessible unless you know that the company that built it is committed to being accessible.
Yep. And
So, first thing I
that's
would
part
do.
of the, I mean, let's take a step back. I mean, that's part of like the DNA and the culture, and like wanting to, obviously, it's not necessarily the whole like do good, because it shouldn't be categorized in that concept, right? I mean,
Right.
it should be, you're building a website, you want everybody and anyone to be able to access the site, right? So, but I do believe it goes back to culture and the company and what they stand for.
Well, I mean, you are doing good by building an accessible website,
Yeah, but
but
it
I
shouldn't
mean,
be
this isn't.
categorized that way.
But it's not charity. This is your
Yes, that's what I
obligation. This is your
mean.
obligation under the law.
That's what I
So it's your
mean.
duty.
Yes, totally. That's why I don't want to categorize it into, well, you're doing something good. Yes, you are. But I mean, you're building a website, you're providing a service and a product. You should want everybody to have access to it. Right. So,
Right, right. I mean, so going back to the whole thing about, like, it's not accessible by accident. So the first thing you look at, and this is like, it may sound ridiculous, but you go to a company's website and you look up accessibility. Like, do a search, on Webflow or whatever, on accessibility. If they have like a if they have a policy, great, you're like halfway there.
yeah.
So if they have a policy, then that means that at least they've heard of it and they're committed to it. If they don't even have a policy, go look elsewhere,
Yeah.
because it means that if we don't have a stated policy, we've never concerned ourselves with it, and we're going to have all kinds of barriers, most likely built into our product, because we've never addressed them. We've never even looked at that. So that's something to look at. A lot of times, if you do a search for accessibility, it'll take you into the support pages, where you can see people talking about accessibility features or stuff that they want, how they want it to be accessible. The other thing to look at is, how quickly are they responding to that? So it's kind of like a joke in the accessibility community, like with
Yeah.
my colleagues, that somebody files one of those and maybe 10 years later they're going to get to addressing those sorts of issues.
Yeah.
So you'll see, like, sort of like memes with a skeleton with cobwebs at the keyboard, still
Yeah.
waiting for accessibility features to be put
Yeah.
in.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, I think to your point, I mean, are there things like keyboards and other type of stuff that really can help for somebody to navigate like their online world?
Actually,
And
no.
other
I
like
mean,
products?
the keyboard accessibility, I think you're talking about something, but it's not about having a special keyboard.
Yeah.
Essentially, the hardest community to design for, or to make sure, like the real challenge and the real benchmark for stuff, is being able to have your website work with a screen reader. which is, so that's why you have all these blind folks that are, plaintiffs in accessibility lawsuits,
Yeah.
because, a website is not going to work for them. There's no visual shortcuts or anything. It
Sure.
has to work. And the screen reader, you have to control your website with a keyboard. So if you can perform everything that you can on the website using a keyboard, you're like 80-90% of the way there towards
Yeah.
accessibility.
Yeah.
So so it's not about designing it to work with a special keyboard. It's more like, does it work with a regular keyboard? Can you go in the forms? Can you fill everything out? Can you jump from field to field with a tab button? Can you scroll up and down and work the site with the arrow keys? So it's all about, can you work this and operate this without using a mouse or a pointing device?
Yeah. So I have a question about that. So visually impaired obviously is the hardest for online accessibility. So how would
Right.
somebody navigate a website if it is set up correctly who is visually impaired?
Um,
So they
you
land
would go
on www.whatever.com.
right. So the first thing is, most websites have navigations and menu at the top.
Yeah.
You don't want to hear that every single time you hit the page.
Yeah.
You don't want to have to listen to 10 minutes of
Yeah. Yeah.
narration of
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
menu item
Yeah.
before you get to the good stuff. So the first thing is, it's going to have skip navigation at the very top.
Yeah.
It's also going to tell you that the what language the website is in.
Yeah.
So this is and that's an easy mistake
And
that a
that
lot of
person
folks.
already has those categories set up on their computer or on their phone or however. I mean, they obviously have like various features so that when they go into a website, it will either trigger that feature or it won't because it hasn't been set up that way, correct?
The website needs to be set up that way
Yeah.
to skip navigation. So
Yes,
it has to be a link that's built into the theme. And the good
exactly.
news is, almost every WordPress theme, out
Has
there,
that.
and everything out there. So that's like the real fundamental stuff, but that's in there. Um, you navigate around, and so at the very top level, you jump either from landmark to landmark. So get me to the main section of the page. Let me know what's an aside. Let me jump from section to section. And those are landmarks that you put in there. And a lot of folks, screen reader users, would use that. Another common way is to jump from link to link. So you hit the tab button, and it'll take you to the next button that's a link. Um, where it gets tricky is, let's say you're going down a page with a whole slew of news stories or PR releases. You click, and it says read more. And it takes you to the
Mhm.
next link. It says read more. Then you click to the next link. So you can't tell all those read more links unless
Yeah,
you put the title of the content into
on
that
the
button.
page.
And
Yeah.
that's something that any web developer worth their salt would know how to do.
Yeah. Got it. Got it. Lots to think about here.
And
Um,
then we could spend 20 minutes talking about how you interact with forms,
yes.
but with a screen reader. But it's super important that every field be labeled. Super important that everything is accessible with the tab, and that you can operate it.
Yeah.
And there are guidelines out there. There are best practices out there that the Web Accessibility Initiative (WAI) puts out there to tell you how all those different form elements should work.
So before accessibility was always it was mandatory from a government standpoint, but now it's not necessarily. Let's like go into like the little grayness of the legalities around accessibility and making your website accessible. So and based on as we mentioned, it's not by state, it's by federal. What did you say again? By federal,
This
like
is
the laws
about
are
district, but that's
by
interpreting
district.
a
Hmm.
federal civil rights law in the United
Yes.
States.
Yes.
And there are equivalent laws in other countries too. I mean, there's like
Yes.
a EU accessibility law, and now there's a new Accessibility Act that came out this year as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, in order for you not to fall into the category of having to determine the language, I mean, it's just best to set it up as much as you can. Now, is a website ever going to be at 100% accessible, or is it always a fraction of like 98%, 99%? Like, what is a safe zone considered? I mean, let's say I'm a business owner, I go out, I build a site, I use the templates. And we can talk about the platforms that you utilize to test whether a site is accessible or not. But what is a good place? And I don't know if it is, do we go the full 9 yards and make sure it's 100% accessible? Are we okay at 70%? What are the main things that somebody needs to ensure that they focus on so that they don't find themselves in a sticky situation with the law?
It really comes down to how serious the barriers are. So you have barriers that are like brick walls
Yeah.
that somebody with a screen reader hits them, and it could be a keyboard trap, it could be a form field that's not labeled, it could be these sort of things that don't have workarounds. And so if you were building a website, if I were a web developer and I hit a barrier like that affected everybody, that would be a major critical bug that would need to be addressed.
Yeah.
Then you have other sorts of issues that are less severe that may have workarounds to them. And then you have other sorts of issues that are kind of just nuisances, like something is redundant or repetitive to somebody who's working with a screen reader.
Yeah.
That's not as critical as something that's a brick wall. Because okay, it's annoying. I can skip past it. It's a little irritating, but it's not like an absolute showstopper or a roadblock.
Yeah.
So those sorts of issues, you know, I think a lot of those sort of website checker tools and stuff will tell you what's critical, and they'll give you alerts for things that are like less important. And so you kind of work your way down. You kind of like triage from like, okay, what are the showstoppers? Let's definitely address those, and then let's work our way down to issues that are not as critical.
Yeah, got it. Okay. And then let's talk a little bit about the platforms that people can utilize to test. I want to talk about two things: the platforms that you can use to test, and then I also want to talk about these widgets that are making a ton of money, that are charging upwards of like $400 to $500 for you to add to your site. And we all know, I mean, even somebody who's an avid online shopper, like I'll go to a major enterprise company like Zara, who's a global company who has a widget that, a client, for example, of mine who's much smaller than them had that same exact widget, and that widget didn't do anything for them. So I want to talk about how to test and like how to stay away from these type of widgets, because essentially they're really not giving you any kind of ADA.
Okay, so I'm going to be biased because I worked, full disclosure, I worked on one of these tools, and
Yeah.
and that's going to be the one I recommend. So there's a tool called Wave that's out there.
Yep.
It's an accessibility checker. It works as an extension on Chrome, or it works as a plugin for your browser, and it's free. So you go to wave.webaim, like
Mm-hmm.
webaim.org,
Mm-hmm.
and you download it, you install it, and you can check your site for it. Now, the one pain is that you can't save a report from that you can use
Yep.
without having a paid plan. But on the other hand, if you're just using it to check, how accessible a theme is, or check your own site, it's a really good, quick tool, and it's organized pretty well. And I don't think it's like super complicated in terms of showing you what it is. And you'll be able to see like on your webpage, you're going to be seeing little icons of where your issues are. Um, so I would recommend using a tool like that. There are other tools that are out there that work on platforms. So I've worked with Site Improve. DQ has one called Axe. That's like the gold standard of
Mm-hmm.
testing tools. Um, I wouldn't necessarily put a business owner to use Axe. I would say like, okay, recommend it to
A
their web
consultant.
developer,
Yeah.
because you need to have a little bit of knowledge about the web to
Sure.
be able to work that. Um, but here's the thing. I mean, and we've run into this ourselves. You have those little tools. You'll see like an icon, usually a circle with either a wheelchair or the accessibility guy on it, and it means that they're running an overlay. And an overlay basically means I haven't fixed the fundamental issues with access on my site. I'm basically paying somebody to run a script on my site that tries to cover up these issues,
Yep.
but I'm not addressing the underlying issues at all.
Yep.
And
So it's like a band-aid.
it is a band aid. And the worst thing is, they don't work.
Yeah. All of
So,
them, correct? I mean, there isn't one out there where it's like you're saving yourself,
none of them will ever get you to 100% accessibility.
especially alone when you haven't done anything to your site.
Right. And then the premise of how they work, we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But they don't address the issues. And every time I test a site with and without without that accessibility plugin installed, because I'll go into my dev tools, I'll block the plugin and then test the site. And the difference is like it's almost minimal. I'd say like maybe in my experience, they address maybe 5 or 10% of the issues. And then the whole premise of like, okay, I'm going to go into this accessibility toolbar and I'm going to choose how I want to look at your website. That's like it. I think that's absurd.
Yeah.
It would be like I'm driving in my car, I go into a particular neighborhood, and then I have to, as I enter that neighborhood, adjust my mirrors and my seat and everything in my car to be able to experience that neighborhood well. I mean, that's silly.
Yeah.
Really, the website should be set up so it works with whatever tools, whatever settings somebody has on their operating system on their device, however they choose to set up their laptop or their phone or whatever, and it should play nicely with those settings. The whole notion of you're disabled and we're going to make you actually fiddle with your settings to be able to see our content. The very premise,
Yeah,
the
it's
whole
horrible.
idea of that is just wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I mean, it goes back to, the concept of this isn't like too good. This isn't charity, like doing good. It's what you should be
Right.
doing from the setup. Um, so what is your advice to, anybody building a site or anybody who is just about to build a site, for their business? Like what are the steps, what are the initial steps that they can start taking? And let's talk about it, like knowing what questions to ask, like who they're hiring from a dev person or a website builder, or let's say they've gone to one of these new companies that are, basically like we can build your website for like $500. So what are the key questions people need to be asking others, because business owners are not going to be doing it themselves, or maybe they are, right? Maybe they just
Right.
need a page and a half, or like whatever it is. But what are the things that they can be thinking about before they start?
So it really comes down to one question
Yeah.
that, if you're fortunate to have a vendor, that's a human and you're interacting with, then you ask them flat out, like, how do you address accessibility?
Yeah.
If it's a platform like, let's say Webflow or Wix or one of those, then hopefully they've addressed that in terms of writing it on their site. Like, this is our policy, this is what we're doing. Ideally, they've not only written that, but they have statements and they have documentation. And you go into their support pages and you see a lot of stuff written about accessibility in their support pages. So that's kind of like the ideal that you want. And then there's different steps away from that. But you have to realize, like, a lot of platforms just flat out don't care
Yeah.
because they're not the ones getting sued. There's like a real popular restaurant reservation application out there. Flat out is not accessible, but restaurants don't have a whole lot of choices in terms of who to work to offer online reservations.
Yeah.
So you have to realize that you are taking a gamble when you're using that software. And yes, there are lawsuits
That are
against
coming from
restaurant
that.
owners who have used that same third party software.
Yeah. And when
And
a
this would be
situation
their
like that happens, Claudio, not to like jump in, but like if a restaurant owner gets hit with that, is is there anything where they can go back and say, well, this is a tool I'm using? Or like, does it ever fall back on the tool that they're using? Or is it just always
no.
100% on their,
and
okay.
and and that's
So
that's I
how are the
think
tools protecting themselves then?
they're not.
Yeah.
They're just like, well, we haven't been sued, so we don't need to change anything.
That's
And it could be,
wild.
that like, 10% of their clients or
Yeah.
customers are getting sued, but it doesn't roll up to them.
That's crazy. So it's like the restaurateur will get sued, but the tool that they're using that's not accessible never gets a lawsuit, or maybe sometimes very,
Correct.
very rare.
Correct.
Interesting. It's
So
because the
so
only
so they're
case in that sense is that when somebody's using it is when it's on their site. And so, how is that the fault of the actual tool from a legal standpoint, I guess, right? I
right,
don't know.
right. And this is why we've made
Why it gets
so
so
little
gray.
progress.
Yeah.
And this is why, you'll post something saying like, hey, this tool needs to be accessible, we need
Yeah.
somebody to do this, and you see so little action happening.
Yeah.
And this is like a strong argument for there being some sort of regulation or
Sure.
something, that's more explicit about accessibility, that affects third-party tools. But and I don't think that's just an American problem. I think that's that same
Global.
problem exists in Europe and in other countries.
Yeah. Let's talk about the tax credit and the tax benefit that can come from this as well, which could be a support to some of the smaller to mid-sized companies that are building this out.
So yeah, it's a good thing you brought that up. So if you are, I believe it's like if your revenues are less than $1 million, or if you have less than, I believe it's 40 employees,
Okay.
then essentially you can say, you can basically treat whatever you're doing to fix accessibility as an expense and get a tax credit for it.
That's amazing. I mean, and that can be found on government websites for people to kind of access and to learn more about that because I mean, a lot of the small businesses are definitely making less than 1 million a year and go ahead.
So there's a fantastic, if you're a business owner, there's a fantastic resource out there, called the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN,
Okay.
that's put together by the federal government. And so there's a website, askjan.org, that you can go to see what sort of accommodations are needed and stuff. And they have like
Everything on
answers
there.
to just about anything.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking of hiring, for instance, a deaf employee, it'll tell you, like basically what accommodations you would need to have
Yeah.
for that deaf employee. It's basically like if I were a business owner, like that would be my
The
go-to for
go-to.
trying to understand what's there.
Yeah. That's great. Claudio, we can go on for hours about this subject, and I think it's very important to address, especially with people starting out, so that they don't get hit with any of these detrimental legal issues down the road. But what are the three key pieces of advice that you can leave the audience with today?
Well, first of all, is understanding that this is somebody's civil right and that is important. This is your obligation. So this is not something that you do, out of kindness, out of charity. I mean, this is your job,
Yeah,
as a
business
business
owner.
owner, and it's that fundamental. It's secondly, and I think we've touched on this a lot, is you're procuring some sort of products and you want to check the accessibility before you buy.
Yeah,
And it's just as important as if you were checking, like, is it secure? Am I getting credit card numbers that could be hacked? So it is a level of compliance that you do really need to concern yourself with.
yeah,
And then finally, I would be like, get yourself educated on accessibility. I have a colleague of mine, Sherry Byrne-Haber. She has a fantastic column out there, where she's publishing constantly, in terms of teaching you how to be accessible and talking about a lot of stuff from the point of view of folks with disabilities.
yeah,
Um, it, and I have to say, I mean, it is not necessarily the easiest thing to get yourself educated in,
yeah.
but there is a lot that's been written out there, and it's over the last 5 or 6 years, I'd say the amount of stuff that's been written on this has doubled.
Yeah.
So this is an area of
That's
increasing
growing.
concern
Yeah,
and stuff that's out there.
yeah. Last but not least, how can people find you and connect with you?
Okay, so I have a website, as a speaker, it's www.claudiovera.com, or I'm totally happy linking into people. So look at my profile up, Claudio Luis Vera on LinkedIn. Tell me that you saw this podcast or you listened to it, and you're interested in finding out more. And for certain, I'd be very happy to connect with you, and be happy to answer your questions going forward.
That's awesome. Claudio, thank you so much for your time. This has been wonderful.
All right. Thanks so much, Sasha. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.